Picture this. It's 508 BC in Athens. A man named Cleisthenes stands before a crowd of citizens, proposing something absolutely radical. He wants to give power not to kings, not to priests, not to the wealthy elite, but to the people themselves. The crowd erupts. Some cheer, others jeer. Nobody knows if this crazy experiment will last a week or a century. Fast forward 2,300 years. A group of colonists in wigs and buckled shoes are about to try that same experiment again, but this time on a scale never before attempted. They're going to build an entire nation on the idea that government derives its power from the consent of the governed. Today, we're going to trace the entire journey of democracy, from its birth in ancient Greece, through its near death in the Dark Ages, to its rebirth in a revolutionary new world. We'll see how America didn't just adopt democracy, it transformed it, tested it, nearly destroyed it, and ultimately shaped what democracy means for the entire modern world. This is the story of humanity's most audacious political experiment. This is the entire history of democracy and America. Let's rewind to ancient Athens, around 500 BC. Now, when you think of ancient civilizations, you probably think of pharaohs, emperors, and kings. That's because pretty much every society throughout history operated on a simple principle. Some people are born to rule, and everyone else is born to obey. But Athens was different. After years of tyranny under rulers like Pisistratos, the Athenians were fed up. Enter Cleisthenes, an aristocrat who proposed something revolutionary, democratia, literally rule by the people. The demos were the common citizens, and kratos meant power. Put them together, and you've got democracy. Here's how it worked. All male citizens, and yes, we'll talk about those limitations in a moment, could participate directly in the assembly. This wasn't representative democracy where you vote for someone to represent you. This was direct democracy. You showed up, you debated, you voted. Every citizen was a legislator. Think about that for a second. Imagine if instead of watching Congress on C-SPAN, you were Congress. You and your neighbors gathering on a hillside to decide whether to go to war, how to spend public funds, or what laws to pass. That's what Athenian democracy looked like. But let's not romanticize it too much. Athenian democracy had some serious flaws. Women couldn't participate, slaves couldn't participate, foreigners couldn't participate. In fact, only about 10–20% of the population qualified as citizens. So when we say rule by the people, we really mean rule by some of the people. Still, for its time, this was revolutionary. And it worked, sort of. Athens became a powerhouse of culture, philosophy, and military might. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, these guys were products of democratic Athens. The Parthenon, the great playwrights, the philosophical schools, all of it flourished under democracy. But here's the thing about democracy. It's fragile. Athens's democratic experiment lasted only about 180 years before being conquered by Macedonia. And even during that time, it had its problems. Socrates, the great philosopher, was sentenced to death by democratic vote. The assembly could be swayed by charismatic demagogues. Mob rule was a constant danger. Plato, in fact, was deeply skeptical of democracy. In his work, The Republic, he argued that democracy inevitably descends into tyranny because the masses lack the wisdom to govern themselves. It's like, he said, letting passengers pilot a ship instead of a trained captain. Sure, it sounds fair, but you're probably going to crash. This tension between liberty and order, between the wisdom of the masses and the expertise of the few, would echo through every democratic experiment that followed. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, another civilization was developing its own flavor of self-governance: Rome. The Romans didn't call their system democracy. They called it a republic, from res publica, meaning public thing or public affair. And there's an important distinction here that will matter a lot when we get to America. In 509 BC, right around the time Athens was getting democratic, Romans overthrew their last king and said, "Never again." They created a complex system of checks and balances designed to prevent any one person from accumulating too much power. Here's the setup. Two consuls shared executive power and could veto each other. The Senate, made up of aristocrats, advised on policy and controlled finances. Tribunes represented the common people and could veto Senate decisions. And various assemblies allowed citizens to vote on laws and elect officials. It was complicated, messy, and brilliant. The Romans had figured out something the Greeks hadn't quite grasped. Pure democracy could be dangerous, but so could concentrated power. The answer was a mixed system, a republic, where power was divided, checked, and balanced. Think of it like a three-legged stool. You've got the monarchical element, the consuls, the aristocratic element, the Senate, and the democratic element, the assemblies. Each leg supports the others, and if anyone gets too strong, the whole thing tips over. This worked remarkably well for about 500 years. Rome went from a small city-state to the dominant power in the Mediterranean. They built roads, aqueducts, and a legal system that still influences us today. But, and this is a big but, Roman republicanism had a fatal flaw. As Rome grew into an empire, the republican system couldn't handle the strain. Generals like Julius Caesar gained too much power. The Senate became corrupt and ineffective, and eventually, the republic collapsed into dictatorship and empire. The death of the Roman Republic taught future generations a crucial lesson. Even the best designed systems of government can fail if citizens aren't vigilant in defending them. As Benjamin Franklin would later say, "The American founders created a republic if you can keep it." With Rome's fall in the 5th century AD, Europe plunged into what we call the Middle Ages. And for democracy, the lights went out for about 1,000 years. From roughly 500 AD to 1500 AD, democracy basically disappeared from Europe. This was the age of feudalism, of kings and queens, of lords and serfs. Political power was hereditary, divinely ordained, and absolute. If you were born a peasant, you died a peasant. If you were born a king, God himself had chosen you to rule. The Catholic Church dominated intellectual life, and its teachings reinforced hierarchical power structures. The Great Chain of Being, a philosophical concept, taught that society was naturally ordered from God at the top, through angels, kings, nobles, and common people, all the way down to animals and plants. Everyone had their place, and challenging that order was challenging God's design. But here's the thing about ideas. You can suppress them, but you can't kill them. Throughout the Middle Ages, embers of democratic thought survived. The Magna Carta, signed in 1215, wasn't democracy, but it established that even kings were subject to law. English Parliament slowly evolved, giving at least some people a say in governance. Italian city-states like Venice and Florence experimented with republican governments. The Icelandic Althing, established in 930 AD, was one of the world's oldest parliaments. These weren't democracies, as we'd recognize them, but they kept alive the idea that government could be something other than pure monarchy. Then came the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment. Boom, boom, boom. Like dominoes falling, each movement challenged traditional authority and opened space for radical new ideas about government. The Protestant Reformation, starting in 1517, broke the Catholic Church's monopoly on religious truth. If people could interpret the Bible for themselves, why couldn't they think for themselves about politics too? The printing press spread ideas faster than ever before. And Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau began articulating theories of government that would revolutionize the world. Locke argued that people have natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and that government exists to protect those rights. If a government fails to do so, the people have the right to overthrow it. Mind-blowing stuff for the 1600s. Montesquieu studied the Roman Republic and argued for separation of powers, executive, legislative, and judicial branches checking each other. Rousseau wrote about the social contract, the idea that legitimate government is based on the consent of the governed. These ideas were incendiary. They challenged centuries of tradition. They threatened kings and aristocrats across Europe, and they found their most receptive audience in an unlikely place, a collection of backwater colonies on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. Let's talk about America before America existed. In the 1600s and 1700s, the eastern coast of North America was a patchwork of British, French, Spanish, and Dutch colonies. We're going to focus on the British colonies that would eventually become the United States. These colonies were different from anything that had come before. Sure, they were under British rule, but they were 3,000 miles away from London. That distance created space, physical and political, for experimentation. The Mayflower Compact of 1620 is often cited as an early example of democratic self-governance. When the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, they created a document agreeing to form a government and abide by its laws. It wasn't democracy in the full sense, but it established the principle of consent and self-governance. Throughout the colonies, town meetings became a fixture of political life, especially in New England. Citizens would gather to debate local issues, elect officials, and make decisions collectively. This was direct democracy on a small scale, and it created a culture of political participation that would prove crucial later. But let's be real. Colonial America was not a democratic paradise. It was hierarchical, often brutal, and deeply unequal. Slavery was entrenched in the southern colonies. Women had virtually no political rights. Property requirements meant only a minority of white men could vote. Native Americans were pushed off their lands and excluded from political society entirely. Still, compared to Europe, the American colonies were relatively egalitarian. Land was more available, social mobility was greater, and there was a spirit of independence that came from living on the frontier. As Alexis de Tocqueville would later observe, Americans developed a unique character, individualistic, entrepreneurial, and suspicious of authority. The colonies were also incredibly diverse. You had Puritans in Massachusetts, Quakers in Pennsylvania, Anglicans in Virginia, Catholics in Maryland. This religious diversity would eventually lead to one of America's most important innovations, the separation of church and state. For decades, the colonies mostly governed themselves. The British Crown was far away and generally left them alone, as long as they were profitable. But in the 1760s, everything changed. Britain had just won the 7 Years' War, called the French and Indian War in America. And it was expensive. The British government decided the colonies should help pay for their own defense. Seems reasonable, right? The colonies disagreed, vehemently. The problem wasn't just the taxes themselves, it was the principle. The colonists had no representation in British Parliament, yet Parliament was taxing them anyway. No taxation without representation became the rallying cry. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, each new tax met with escalating resistance. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 was the colonists' way of saying, "We're done playing by your rules." Britain responded with the Coercive Acts, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. Tensions spiraled. Here's what's crucial to understand. The colonists didn't start out wanting independence. Most saw themselves as British subjects demanding their rights as Englishmen. They appealed to British law, British tradition, British liberty. But Britain wouldn't listen. And so, reluctantly at first, then with growing conviction, the colonists began to imagine the unimaginable, breaking away entirely and creating a new nation based on radically new principles. April 19th, 1775, Lexington and Concord. The shot heard round the world. The American Revolution had begun. But this wasn't just a military conflict. It was an ideological one. The colonists needed to explain to themselves and to the world why they were taking such a drastic step. They needed to articulate a philosophy of government that justified revolution. Enter Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. On July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted a document that would change history. Listen to these words. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." This was revolutionary, literally. Jefferson was saying that rights don't come from government or kings. They come from nature, from God, from the very fact of being human. And government's only legitimate purpose is to protect those rights. If it fails to do so, the people have the right to alter or abolish it. Think about how radical this was. In most of the world, political authority flowed from the top down, from God to king to subjects. Jefferson flipped it upside down. Authority flows from the bottom up, from the people to the government they create. Of course, there's massive hypocrisy here too. All men are created equal, unless you're black or Native American or a woman. Jefferson himself owned slaves. This contradiction between America's ideals and its reality would haunt the nation for centuries. We'll come back to that. The revolution itself lasted 8 years. Against all odds, the colonists won. Britain, the world's most powerful empire, was defeated by a ragtag army of farmers and merchants led by George Washington. It seemed like a miracle. But winning independence was one thing. Building a functional government was another. The first attempt was the Articles of Confederation, adopted in 1781. This created a loose alliance of states with a weak central government. and I mean weak. Congress couldn't tax, couldn't regulate commerce, couldn't enforce laws. Each state was basically its own little country. Predictably, this was a disaster. The national government was broke. States fought with each other. There was no unified currency. Shays' Rebellion in 1786, an uprising of indebted farmers, showed how close the young nation was to collapse. Something had to be done. In May 1787, delegates from 12 states met in Philadelphia for what we now call the Constitutional Convention. Their task: fix the Articles of Confederation. What they did instead: throw it out and write an entirely new constitution. The debates at that convention were intense. How much power should the central government have? How should states be represented? How do you prevent tyranny while still creating a government strong enough to function? The delegates were well read in history and political philosophy. They knew about Athenian democracy and its flaws. They studied the Roman Republic extensively. They read Montesquieu on separation of powers and Locke on natural rights. They were designing a government with 2,000 years of political thought to draw upon. What they created was something genuinely new: a constitutional republic with democratic elements built on separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism. Let's break that down. It's a republic, not a pure democracy. Citizens elect representatives rather than making all decisions directly. It's constitutional, meaning the government's power is limited by a written document. It has separation of powers: legislative, executive, and judicial branches that check each other. And it's federal, meaning power is divided between national and state governments. The legislative branch, Congress, was split into two chambers to balance the interests of large and small states. The Senate gave equal representation to each state, while the House was based on population. This was called the Great Compromise, and it nearly didn't happen. The executive branch was headed by a president with significant but limited powers. The president could veto laws, but Congress could override the veto. The president commanded the military, but Congress declared war and controlled funding. The president made treaties, but the Senate had to ratify them. The judicial branch was independent, with judges serving for life to insulate them from political pressure. This branch would eventually claim the power of judicial review, the ability to declare laws unconstitutional. The whole system was designed with one principle in mind: prevent tyranny. As James Madison wrote in Federalist 51, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. By pitting power against power, the founders hoped to keep any one person or group from dominating. But there was fierce debate about whether this new constitution was a good idea. The Federalists, led by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, argued for ratification. The Anti-Federalists worried it created a government too powerful and too distant from the people. The Anti-Federalists had some legitimate concerns. Where was the protection for individual rights? What about freedom of speech, religion, and the press? The Federalists promised that a Bill of Rights would be added immediately after ratification. In 1788, enough states ratified the Constitution for it to take effect. In 1789, George Washington was inaugurated as the first president, and in 1791, the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, were ratified, guaranteeing fundamental freedoms and placing explicit limits on government power. The American experiment had officially begun. The ink on the Constitution was barely dry when Americans started testing its limits. The first decades under the new government were turbulent, to say the least. George Washington set important precedents. He voluntarily stepped down after 2 terms, establishing that the presidency wasn't a lifetime position. He tried to stay above partisan politics, though he wasn't always successful. His farewell address warned against political parties and foreign entanglements, advice Americans promptly ignored. Because by the 1790s, political parties were already forming. On one side were the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, who wanted a strong central government, a national bank, and close ties with Britain. On the other side were the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, who favored states' rights, agrarian interests, and sympathy for revolutionary France. The election of 1800 was a crisis. Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr, tied in the Electoral College, throwing the election to the House of Representatives. It took 36 ballots and intense political maneuvering before Jefferson finally won. The peaceful transfer of power from Federalists to Democratic Republicans was a milestone. It showed that American democracy could survive political transitions. But not all transitions were peaceful. In 1804, Aaron Burr, then vice president, killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel. Yes, the vice president killed a former Treasury Secretary in a duel. Let that sink in. The early republic also faced external challenges. The War of 1812 against Britain nearly ended in disaster. British forces burned Washington, D.C. in 1814. The White House was torched. It seemed like American independence might be reversed before it was even secure. But America survived, and something interesting happened. After the War of 1812, a sense of national identity began to solidify. The era of good feelings under President James Monroe saw decreased partisan conflict and territorial expansion. The Monroe Doctrine asserted American influence over the Western Hemisphere. Westward expansion brought new challenges. As territories became states, a critical question emerged. Would they be free or slave states? This question would dominate American politics for decades. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 tried to maintain balance by admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, and drawing a line across the continent. Slavery allowed south of the line, prohibited north of it. Thomas Jefferson, nearing the end of his life, called the Missouri controversy a fire bell in the night that awakened him to the mortal danger slavery posed to the Union. Meanwhile, democracy itself was expanding. Sort of. The 1820s and 1830s saw the rise of Jacksonian democracy, named after President Andrew Jackson. Property requirements for voting were gradually eliminated, at least for white men. Political participation increased dramatically. Jackson positioned himself as a champion of the common man against elites. But Jacksonian democracy had a dark side. Jackson's Indian Removal Act of 1830 led to the Trail of Tears, forcibly relocating tens of thousands of Native Americans and causing thousands of deaths. Jackson's vision of democracy extended only to white men. Everyone else was excluded or oppressed. This era also saw the rise of reform movements. The abolitionist movement gained strength, arguing that slavery was incompatible with American ideals. Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave turned powerful orator, asked pointedly, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" Women's rights activists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, demanding equality and suffrage. The 1850s were increasingly fractious. The Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision, each attempted to resolve the slavery question, and each failed, pushing the nation closer to catastrophe. The Dred Scott decision in 1857 was particularly egregious. The Supreme Court ruled that black people, whether free or enslaved, could not be American citizens and had no standing to sue in federal court. Chief Justice Roger Taney wrote that black people had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. This decision inflamed tensions and made compromise increasingly impossible. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. He won without a single Southern electoral vote. Southern states saw this as an existential threat and began seceding from the Union. By the time Lincoln was inaugurated in March 1861, 7 states had left, with 4 more to follow. Lincoln's first inaugural address pleaded for reconciliation. "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." But it was too late. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. The Civil War was the greatest crisis in American history. More Americans died in this conflict than in all other American wars combined. The very survival of the United States was in question. And at stake was a fundamental question. What kind of democracy would America be? The Confederacy claimed it was fighting for states' rights and self-governance, that they had the right to secede and form their own government. But let's be clear, the right they were primarily defending was the right to own human beings as property. The Confederate Constitution explicitly protected slavery. The Confederate Vice President, Alexander Stephens, said plainly that the Confederacy's cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. Lincoln initially framed the war as being about preserving the Union, not ending slavery. He feared that making it about slavery would push border states to secede. But as the war dragged on, Lincoln's position evolved. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all slaves in Confederate territory were free. This didn't immediately free anyone. The Confederacy wasn't obeying Union orders, but it fundamentally transformed the war's meaning. Now it was explicitly a war to end slavery. The Gettysburg Address in November 1863 articulated what was at stake. In just 272 words, Lincoln redefined American democracy. The nation was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. The war was testing whether any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure, and the living had a duty to ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Notice what Lincoln did there. He took Jefferson's words, "All men are created equal," and made them central to America's identity. He argued that democracy itself was on trial. If the Union fell, it would prove that democracy was impractical, that nations based on equality and self-governance couldn't survive. The whole world was watching to see if this experiment would fail. The war was brutal. Battles like Antietam, Gettysburg, and the Wilderness saw casualties on a scale never before experienced by Americans. New weapons made combat deadlier than ever. Both sides committed atrocities. The home front suffered too. Economies disrupted, families torn apart, entire regions devastated. But in April 1865, the war finally ended. General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The Union had survived. Slavery was finished. 5 days later, John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater. The nation that had just celebrated victory was plunged into mourning. Lincoln's death remains one of the great tragedies of American history. The man who had guided the nation through its darkest hour wouldn't live to guide its reconstruction. The task of rebuilding the nation fell to Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, and to Congress. The Reconstruction period from 1865 to 1877 was supposed to integrate formerly enslaved people into American society as full citizens. 3 constitutional amendments were passed. The 13th abolished slavery, the 14th guaranteed citizenship and equal protection under the law, and the 15th protected voting rights regardless of race. For a brief moment, real democracy seemed possible. Black men voted, held office, and participated in government throughout the South. Black congressmen and senators were elected. State governments enacted progressive reforms. But this progress was met with violent resistance. The Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups terrorized black communities. Northern political will for enforcing Reconstruction waned. And in the Compromise of 1877, Reconstruction was effectively ended. Federal troops withdrew from the South, and white supremacists retook control. What followed was the nadir of American race relations. Jim Crow laws enforced segregation and stripped black Americans of their rights. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright violence prevented black people from voting. The Supreme Court's Plessy v. Ferguson decision in 1896 enshrined separate but equal as constitutional, giving legal cover to segregation. American democracy had failed its greatest test. The promise of equality remained unfulfilled. As America entered the 20th century, it was rapidly transforming. Industrialization was creating massive wealth, but also massive inequality. Cities were crowded and corrupt. Political machines, like Tammany Hall, controlled urban politics through patronage and graft. Robber barons built monopolies in oil, steel, and railroads. In response, the progressive movement emerged, seeking to use government power to address social problems. Progressives pushed for regulation of big business, improved working conditions, clean government, and expanded democracy. Several important reforms expanded democratic participation. The 17th Amendment, ratified in 1913, established direct election of senators. Previously, state legislatures had chosen them. This made the Senate more responsive to popular will. More significantly, the 19th Amendment in 1920 finally gave women the right to vote. This was the culmination of decades of activism by suffragettes who had marched, protested, gone on hunger strikes, and been arrested for demanding their basic rights. It's worth noting that this still left out many women of color who faced additional barriers to voting. American democracy was also beginning to project power globally. The Spanish-American War in 1898 made America an imperial power, acquiring territories like Puerto Rico and the Philippines. President Theodore Roosevelt's motto, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," reflected America's growing international assertiveness. But it was World War I that truly thrust America onto the world stage. Initially, the US remained neutral, but in 1917, America entered the war on the Allied side. President Woodrow Wilson framed it as a crusade to make the world safe for democracy. After the war, Wilson proposed the League of Nations, an international organization to prevent future conflicts. It was based on the idea that democracies are less likely to go to war with each other and that international cooperation could maintain peace. But ironically, the US Senate refused to join the League. American isolationism won out. The 1920s were a time of prosperity, but also of serious democratic backsliding. The Red Scare saw suppression of free speech and persecution of radicals. Immigration restrictions, especially targeting people from Southern and Eastern Europe and Asia, reflected nativist xenophobia. Prohibition, while enacted democratically, showed the dangers of using government to enforce moral preferences. Then came the Great Depression. Beginning in 1929, the economy collapsed. Unemployment reached 25%. Banks failed. People lost their homes and savings. Bread lines and shanty towns became common sights. American capitalism, and by extension, American democracy, seemed to be failing. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president in 1932, promising a New Deal for the American people. Over the next decade, FDR fundamentally expanded the role of government in American life. Social security, unemployment insurance, labor rights, financial regulation, public works programs, the New Deal touched every aspect of society. This was controversial. Critics argued FDR was destroying American liberty and creating a socialist state. But FDR saw it differently. In his 1944 State of the Union address, he argued for a second Bill of Rights, economic rights like the right to a job, to adequate food and clothing, to a decent home, to medical care. He believed that necessitous men are not free men, and that political liberty required economic security. The New Deal didn't end the Depression. World War II did that, but it fundamentally changed Americans' expectations of government. Democracy now meant not just political rights, but also economic protections. World War II was another defining moment. Once again, America was initially reluctant to enter a European war. But the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, ended that debate. America mobilized for total war on a scale never before seen. The war was framed as a battle between democracy and tyranny. America, Britain, and their allies fought against Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. The Atlantic Charter, signed by Roosevelt and Churchill in 1941, outlined Allied goals, including self-determination for all peoples and freedom from want and fear. But American democracy was deeply compromised during the war. Over 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of them citizens, were forcibly relocated to internment camps, one of the greatest civil liberties violations in American history. Meanwhile, segregation remained the law of the land. Black soldiers fought for freedom abroad while being denied equality at home. As the NAACP pointed out, it was a double V campaign: victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. When the war ended in 1945, America emerged as a global superpower. The old European empires were shattered. The Soviet Union, America's wartime ally, was now its ideological opponent. And America positioned itself as the leader of the free world. The United Nations was created, succeeding where the League of Nations had failed. The Marshall Plan rebuilt war-torn Europe. NATO created a military alliance of democracies. America was actively promoting democracy worldwide, though often selectively supporting anti-communist dictators while undermining democratically elected leftists. At home, returning veterans benefited from the GI Bill, which subsidized education and home ownership, helping to create a prosperous middle class. But these benefits weren't equally distributed. Discriminatory practices often excluded black veterans. The stage was set for the next great expansion of American democracy, the Civil Rights Movement. The 1950s and 60s were a time of profound social change in America. The contradiction between American ideals and American reality, particularly regarding race, could no longer be ignored. The Civil Rights Movement had many origins, but a key moment was the Brown vs. Board of Education decision in 1954. The Supreme Court ruled that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, overturning Plessy versus Ferguson. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. But Southern states resisted fiercely. When 9 black students tried to integrate Little Rock Central High School in 1957, they were met by mobs and the Arkansas National Guard, blocking their entry. President Eisenhower had to send federal troops to enforce the court order. The world saw images of young black students being screamed at and threatened just for trying to go to school. The movement gained momentum through various tactics: boycotts, sit-ins, freedom rides, marches. In Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her bus seat sparked a year-long boycott that brought a young minister named Martin Luther King Jr. to national prominence. King's philosophy of nonviolent resistance, inspired by Gandhi, proved powerful. When black protesters were beaten, fire-hosed, and attacked by police dogs on national television, it shocked many white Americans into action. The movement's moral clarity was undeniable. The March on Washington in 1963 brought 250,000 people to the nation's capital. King's "I Have a Dream" speech articulated a vision of racial equality rooted in America's founding principles. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." But the movement faced violent opposition. Medgar Evers was assassinated in 1963. 4 little girls were killed in the Birmingham church bombing. Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965. And in 1968, both Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy were assassinated. Despite the violence, the movement achieved landmark legislative victories. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 banned discriminatory voting practices like literacy tests and poll taxes, and authorized federal oversight of elections in areas with histories of discrimination. These laws fundamentally transformed American democracy. For the first time since Reconstruction, Black Americans in the South could actually exercise their right to vote. The number of black elected officials grew dramatically. The Democratic Party, which had been the party of segregation in the South, realigned, while many white Southerners switched to the Republican Party. But the Civil Rights Movement was never just about race. It inspired other groups to demand equality and rights. The women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 70s challenged sexism and discrimination. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique in 1963 sparked a wave of feminist activism. The National Organization for Women fought for equal pay, reproductive rights, and the Equal Rights Amendment. The gay rights movement gained visibility with the Stonewall riots in 1969, when LGBTQ people fought back against police harassment. This sparked a movement that would continue for decades, ultimately achieving marriage equality in 2015. Native Americans organized too. The American Indian Movement occupied Alcatraz Island and Wounded Knee, demanding recognition of treaty rights and sovereignty. They pushed back against centuries of dispossession and cultural genocide. Hispanic and Latino Americans organized for labor rights and political representation. Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers fought for dignity and fair treatment for agricultural workers. The Chicano movement demanded educational opportunity and political power. All of these movements were expanding the definition of who counted in American democracy. Democracy was no longer just for property-owning white men. It was, slowly and painfully, becoming more inclusive. But the 1960s and 70s were also tumultuous in other ways. The Vietnam War divided the nation. Young people protested a war they saw as unjust, with some burning draft cards and fleeing to Canada. The Watergate scandal revealed presidential corruption and led to Richard Nixon's resignation, showing that in America, even the president was subject to the rule of law. Trust in institutions plummeted. The social consensus of the 1950s shattered into competing visions of what America should be. The culture wars had begun. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, American democracy existed in the context of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union, two superpowers with opposing ideologies, competed for global influence without directly fighting each other, hence Cold War. This competition shaped American democracy in profound ways. On one hand, America promoted itself as the beacon of freedom, contrasting its democratic system with Soviet totalitarianism. When Nikita Khrushchev pounded his shoe at the United Nations and said, "We will bury you," America responded by showcasing its prosperity, innovation, and liberty. The space race became a proxy battle. When the Soviets launched Sputnik in 1957, Americans panicked that they were falling behind. President Kennedy committed America to landing a man on the moon, which happened in 1969. This wasn't just about exploration. It was about proving that democracy could achieve technological triumphs. But the Cold War also compromised American democracy. McCarthyism in the early 1950s saw reckless accusations of communist infiltration, destroying careers and lives with little evidence. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover engaged in illegal surveillance and harassment of activists, including Martin Luther King Jr. The CIA overthrew democratically elected governments in Iran, Guatemala, and Chile, installing authoritarian regimes friendly to American interests. This revealed a tension in American foreign policy that persists today. America champions democracy in principle, but often prioritizes strategic interests in practice. During the Cold War, anti-communism trumped democratic values. "He may be a son of a bitch," FDR reportedly said of a Latin American dictator, "but he's our son of a bitch." The Cold War also drove domestic policy. Fear of falling behind the Soviets led to massive investments in education, science, and infrastructure. The interstate highway system, created under Eisenhower, was justified partly as a defense measure. Federal funding for universities and research exploded. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan took a confrontational approach to the Soviet Union, calling it an evil empire and launching a military buildup. But he also believed that supporting democracy movements behind the Iron Curtain would ultimately bring down communism. He was right. Though not entirely because of American policy, the Soviet system was rotting from within. Its economy couldn't compete. Its ideology had lost legitimacy. When Mikhail Gorbachev introduced glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, it unleashed forces he couldn't control. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War was over. Democracy had won. Francis Fukuyama famously declared the end of history, arguing that liberal democracy had triumphed as the final form of government. Western-style democracy and capitalism would spread worldwide. It was only a matter of time before every nation became democratic. This optimism shaped the 1990s. The United States was the sole superpower. American culture, movies, music, fast food spread globally. The internet was connecting the world. Democracy seemed ascendant. President Bill Clinton spoke of enlarging the community of democracies. The European Union expanded eastward, bringing former communist countries into a democratic alliance. The Washington Consensus promoted free markets and democratic governance as the path to prosperity. But this triumphalism was premature. Democracy's victory was not as complete or inevitable as it seemed. The 21st century has tested American democracy in ways few anticipated. The attacks of September 11, 2001, were a profound shock. Nearly 3,000 people were killed in a single morning. America's sense of invulnerability was shattered. The response reshaped American democracy and foreign policy. The war on terror led to wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that lasted decades, cost trillions of dollars, and killed hundreds of thousands. The Patriot Act expanded government surveillance powers, raising concerns about civil liberties. Guantanamo Bay became a symbol of America's willingness to compromise its values in the name of security. The Iraq War, in particular, was controversial from the start. The Bush administration claimed Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and ties to al-Qaeda. Both claims proved false. The war destabilized the entire Middle East, creating conditions for the rise of ISIS. It eroded trust in government and damaged America's credibility globally. Meanwhile, at home, American democracy was becoming increasingly polarized. The 2000 election, decided by the Supreme Court after the Florida recount controversy, left many Democrats feeling the election had been stolen. The rise of partisan media, especially cable news and talk radio, created echo chambers where Americans consumed entirely different information. The financial crisis of 2008 was another devastating blow. The housing market collapsed, major banks failed, and the economy plunged into the worst recession since the Great Depression. Millions lost their homes and jobs. The government bailed out banks while ordinary people suffered, fueling anger and cynicism. Barack Obama's election in 2008 as America's first black president was a historic moment, seemingly proof of racial progress. But it also triggered a backlash. The Tea Party movement emerged, ostensibly about limited government, but often tinged with racial resentment. Conspiracy theories, including the absurd claim that Obama wasn't born in America, gained traction. Obama's presidency saw significant achievements. The Affordable Care Act extended health insurance to millions. The economy recovered. LGBTQ rights advanced, and diplomatic efforts included the Iran nuclear deal and the Paris Climate Agreement. But it also saw political dysfunction. Republican Senate leader Mitch McConnell stated that his top priority was making Obama a one-term president. Partisan gridlock became the norm. The Supreme Court's Citizens United decision in 2010 allowed unlimited corporate spending on elections, flooding the political system with money. Voting rights were eroded as the court gutted key provisions of the Voting Rights Act in 2013. Gerrymandering became increasingly sophisticated, with parties using data and technology to draw districts that guaranteed their dominance. Meanwhile, economic inequality grew. The top 1% captured an ever larger share of wealth, while middle-class incomes stagnated. Manufacturing jobs disappeared, often moving overseas or replaced by automation. Communities that once thrived economically felt left behind. This fueled anger at elites, experts, and institutions. Social media emerged as a powerful force, initially celebrated as democratizing. The Arab Spring of 2011 seemed to show how platforms like Twitter and Facebook could enable democratic movements. But social media also spread misinformation, amplified extremism, and enabled foreign interference in elections. The 2016 election was an earthquake. Donald Trump, a real estate mogul and reality TV star with no political experience, won the Republican nomination by breaking every rule of conventional politics. He attacked immigrants, mocked a disabled reporter, bragged about sexually assaulting women, and promised to drain the swamp of Washington corruption. His opponent, Hillary Clinton, was experienced and qualified, but also represented the establishment many voters distrusted. Trump's message that the system was rigged, that elites had betrayed working people, that he alone could fix it, resonated with millions. Trump lost the popular vote by nearly 3 million, but won the Electoral College. His presidency was unlike any in American history. He attacked the media as fake news and the enemy of the people. He showed contempt for democratic norms and institutions. He cozied up to dictators while alienating democratic allies. He fired officials investigating him and pardoned political allies. But he also tapped into real grievances. Many Americans felt ignored by coastal elites, dismissed as deplorables, told their concerns about immigration and economic dislocation were racist or ignorant. Trump gave voice to their anger, even as he exploited it for his own benefit. The 2020 election occurred amid a pandemic that killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. Trump's mishandling of COVID-19 likely cost him re-election. Joe Biden won both the popular vote and Electoral College decisively. But Trump refused to accept defeat. He claimed, without evidence, that the election was stolen through massive fraud. Dozens of lawsuits were filed and dismissed. Election officials, many of them Republicans, certified the results, yet Trump and his allies persisted. On January 6, 2021, a mob of Trump supporters attacked the U.S. Capitol while Congress was certifying Biden's victory. They broke through police lines, invaded the building, vandalized offices, and forced lawmakers to flee. 5 people died. It was the first violent attack on the Capitol since the War of 1812. This was a direct assault on American democracy, an attempt to overturn a legitimate election through force. Trump had spent weeks telling his supporters the election was stolen and urging them to fight like hell. When the violence began, he watched on television for hours before telling rioters to go home, while also saying, "We love you, you're very special." The attack failed. Congress reconvened that night and certified Biden's victory. Democracy held, but barely. The fact that a defeated president attempted to overturn an election and faced few immediate consequences revealed how fragile democratic institutions had become. So where does American democracy stand today? That's the question we need to grapple with. Because the truth is, democracy in America and around the world faces challenges as serious as any since World War II. First, let's acknowledge that democracy globally is in retreat. According to Freedom House, democracy has declined for 17 consecutive years. Authoritarian regimes in China, Russia, and elsewhere are becoming more assertive. Hungary and Turkey, once promising democracies, have slid toward authoritarianism. Even established democracies in Europe face rising populism and illiberalism. China, in particular, presents an ideological challenge. It has achieved economic growth and technological advancement without democracy, suggesting to some that authoritarian capitalism is a viable alternative to democratic capitalism. The Chinese Communist Party argues that its system is more efficient, more stable, and better suited to the modern world than messy, gridlocked democracy. Russia, under Vladimir Putin, actively works to undermine democracy worldwide. Russian intelligence interfered in the 2016 US election, not necessarily to elect Trump, but to sow chaos and discredit democratic institutions. They've done the same across Europe. Putin understands that strong democracies threaten his authoritarian rule, so he seeks to weaken them. Within America, the challenges to democracy are both structural and cultural. Structurally, American democracy has some fundamental flaws. The Electoral College means a candidate can win while losing the popular vote. This has happened twice in the last 6 elections. The Senate gives equal representation to states regardless of population, meaning voters in Wyoming have far more power per capita than voters in California. The filibuster allows a minority to block legislation. Gerrymandering allows politicians to choose their voters rather than voters choosing their politicians. Money in politics is corrosive. Running for office requires raising enormous sums, giving wealthy donors and corporate interests outsized influence. Politicians spend more time fundraising than legislating. The revolving door between government and lobbying firms creates conflicts of interest. Voter suppression is a growing problem. After the Supreme Court weakened the Voting Rights Act, many states have enacted laws making it harder to vote, limiting early voting, requiring strict ID, purging voter rolls, reducing polling places in minority neighborhoods. These laws disproportionately affect poor people and people of color. The judiciary has become intensely politicized. Supreme Court confirmations are partisan battles. The court's legitimacy suffers when it's seen as just another political institution. The fact that justices serve for life means that a president who serves 4 years can shape the court for decades. Culturally, Americans are more divided than at any time since the Civil War. We live in different informational universes, consuming different media and believing different facts. Conspiracy theories spread rapidly online. QAnon, the big lie about the stolen election, anti-vaccine misinformation, these aren't fringe beliefs, but are held by significant portions of the population. Political polarization has intensified. Americans increasingly see the other party not just as wrong, but as dangerous. We're sorted geographically, with Democrats concentrated in cities and Republicans in rural areas, reducing contact across partisan lines. Mixed political marriages have declined. We choose friends, where to live, even consumer products based on partisan identity. Trust in institutions, government, media, science, education has cratered. When people don't trust institutions, democracy becomes impossible. How do you have legitimate elections if millions believe they're rigged? How do you govern when people reject expertise and scientific consensus? The rise of illiberal democracy is concerning. Democracy isn't just about voting. It's about protecting minority rights, maintaining free press, preserving an independent judiciary, and accepting election results. Increasingly, some politicians embrace the trappings of democracy while undermining its substance. They win elections, but then attack democratic institutions that constrain their power. Climate change poses an existential challenge that democracy seems unable to address. The scientific consensus is clear. We must dramatically reduce carbon emissions or face catastrophic consequences. But the changes required are politically difficult. Short-term thinking and partisan divisions prevent action. Authoritarian China can impose policy from the top. Democracies must persuade citizens to accept sacrifices for future benefits. Some worry that democracy is too slow to respond to the climate crisis. Technological change creates new challenges. Artificial intelligence, automation, and biotechnology will transform society in ways we can barely imagine. How do democracies govern technologies that change faster than we can write laws? How do we balance innovation with safety? Who benefits from new technologies and who gets left behind? But here's the thing. Democracy has always faced challenges. It's always been imperfect. It's always required effort, vigilance, and renewal. Let me ask you a fundamental question. Why should we care about democracy? What makes it worth defending? It's worth asking because democracy is not natural or inevitable. For most of human history, people lived under kings, emperors, and warlords. Authority was inherited, power was concentrated, and the idea that common people should govern themselves seemed absurd. Democracy is a recent experiment in human history and one that has frequently failed. So why does it matter? First, democracy respects human dignity. It's based on the idea that people are capable of self-governance, that we don't need masters to tell us how to live. Every person has inherent worth and deserves a say in decisions that affect their lives. As Lincoln said, it's the difference between government of the people, by the people, for the people, and government of the people by someone else for someone else's benefit. Think about it this way. In an authoritarian system, you're a subject. Your role is to obey. You have no say in the laws that govern you, the taxes you pay, the wars fought in your name. In a democracy, you're a citizen. You have rights, responsibilities, and voice. You might be outvoted, but you can't be ignored. Second, democracy protects freedom better than any alternative. By dispersing power, creating checks and balances, and protecting individual rights, democracy limits what government can do to you. Authoritarians promise efficiency and order, but they always end up abusing power. Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Pol Pot, the 20th century's greatest atrocities were committed by authoritarian regimes. Yes, democracies can commit atrocities too. Slavery, Indian removal, Japanese internment. But democracies have mechanisms for self-correction that authoritarian systems lack. Free press, opposition parties, independent courts, and protest movements can expose injustice and demand change. Authoritarian systems suppress dissent and hide their crimes. Third, democracy tends to produce better outcomes. Not always, not immediately, but over time. Democratic countries are wealthier, healthier, more innovative, and less likely to go to war with each other than authoritarian ones. Why? Because democracy allows for the free exchange of ideas, rewards merit over birth, and gives people incentives to invest in the future. Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, observed that famines don't occur in functioning democracies. Why? Because democratic governments must respond to public pressure. If people are starving and there's a free press reporting it and opposition parties demanding action, the government must respond or be voted out. Authoritarian governments can ignore suffering because they face no consequences. Fourth, democracy is the best mechanism we have for peacefully resolving disputes. In a dictatorship, if you disagree with the ruler, your options are to submit, flee, or fight. In a democracy, you can organize, persuade, vote, and change the government without violence. Elections are a peaceful substitute for revolution. That doesn't mean democratic politics is always peaceful. We've seen it's often ugly, contentious, and frustrating. But it beats the alternative. As Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those others that have been tried. Fifth, democracy is morally legitimate in a way other systems aren't. If laws are made by the people they govern, those laws have democratic legitimacy. You might disagree with a law, but you participated in the process that created it, and you can work to change it. Authoritarian laws lack this legitimacy. They're imposed by force, not consent. This matters more than you might think. Legitimate governments are more stable, more effective, and more respected. People obey laws not just because they fear punishment, but because they accept the authority of the law. But, and this is crucial, democracy isn't self-sustaining. It requires constant maintenance, vigilance, and participation. Benjamin Franklin was asked after the Constitutional Convention what kind of government had been created. He replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." That "if you can keep it" is the key. Democracy isn't a machine that runs itself. It's a garden that needs tending. What does that mean practically? It means you have to participate. Vote yes, but also stay informed, engage in your community, hold representatives accountable. It means accepting that you won't always win. Democracy requires losers to accept defeat and winners to govern responsibly. It means respecting democratic norms even when it's inconvenient. It means understanding that democracy is a process, not a destination. There will always be problems to solve, injustices to correct, new challenges to address. The work is never done. It means recognizing that democracy is fragile. It can die through a coup, through gradual erosion of norms and institutions, or through citizens simply giving up on it. We've seen this throughout history and around the world, but it also means recognizing that democracy is resilient. It survived wars, depressions, scandals, and social upheaval. It's expanded from covering a tiny fraction of humanity to being the aspiration, if not reality, for billions. It's not perfect, but it's improved. It's bent toward justice, even if the arc is long. So what does the future hold? I wish I could tell you with certainty, but the truth is, we're living through a pivotal moment, and the outcome is far from determined. There are two possible futures I see for American democracy, and by extension, for democracy globally, since America has been so influential in spreading democratic ideals. In the pessimistic scenario, American democracy continues to decline. Polarization intensifies. Elections become more contested, with losing sides refusing to accept results. Political violence increases. Democratic norms continue eroding. Voter suppression gets worse. Gerrymandering becomes even more extreme. The Supreme Court makes partisan rulings that undermine democratic processes. In this scenario, America doesn't necessarily become a full dictatorship, but it becomes what political scientists call an illiberal democracy or competitive authoritarian system. Elections still happen, but they're not quite free or fair. Opposition exists, but it's hampered by structural barriers and sometimes intimidation. The forms of democracy remain, but the substance hollows out. This would have global consequences. If American democracy fails, authoritarian regimes everywhere will point to it as proof that democracy doesn't work. The end of history would be revealed as a fantasy. The 21st century would belong to authoritarian capitalism, not democratic liberalism. In the optimistic scenario, America confronts its challenges and renews its democracy. Reforms make the system more representative, eliminating the Electoral College or using the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, ending partisan gerrymandering through independent redistricting, reforming campaign finance, protecting and expanding voting rights, making it easier to vote, and making democracy more responsive to popular will. Cultural changes happen too. Americans find ways to bridge divides, to consume more diverse media, to engage with people who disagree. Trust in institutions rebuilds through transparency and accountability. A new generation of leaders emerges who put country over party. In this scenario, America once again becomes a model for democracy worldwide. It shows that democracy can adapt to new challenges, can self-correct, can deliver for its citizens. The 21st century sees a new wave of democratic expansion and renewal. Which future we get depends on choices being made right now. And that's where you come in. Because here's the secret about democracy. It's not really about politicians or institutions. It's about citizens. Democracy is a system of government that fundamentally depends on people like you giving a damn. If you're an American, that means voting in every election, not just presidential ones. Local elections often matter more for your daily life. School board, city council, state legislature. These officials make decisions that directly affect you. And their elections often have much lower turnout, meaning your vote counts even more. But it's not just voting. It's staying informed, and I mean really informed, not just scrolling social media or watching partisan news. Seek out quality journalism. Read deeply. Follow multiple perspectives. Develop media literacy so you can distinguish truth from propaganda. It's engaging in your community. Attend town halls. Join local organizations. Volunteer. Run for office yourself, even if it's just the local school board. Democracy happens at every level, and local engagement is how most people can have the most impact. It's having conversations, especially with people you disagree with. Not shouting matches on social media, but real conversations where you listen and try to understand. You don't have to change your views, but you might find that people you disagree with aren't monsters. They have legitimate concerns, different priorities, or different experiences that lead them to different conclusions. It's holding your own side accountable. This is hard. It's easy to criticize the other party. It's much harder to call out problems on your own side. But that's how democracy stays healthy, when citizens demand integrity regardless of partisan advantage. It's accepting that democracy is frustrating. It's slow. It's messy. It rarely gives you exactly what you want. Compromise is necessary. Sometimes the other side wins. That's not a bug, it's a feature. Democracy is designed to prevent any one faction from having total control. It's teaching the next generation. Talk to young people about democracy, about history, about why it matters, not in a preachy way, but through stories and engagement. Take them with you when you vote. Discuss current events. Model democratic citizenship. If you're not American, many of the same principles apply. Whatever country you are in, democracy needs active citizens, and global democracy needs defenders too. Support democratic movements worldwide. Hold your government accountable for supporting democracy abroad. Oppose authoritarianism wherever it appears. Here's what gives me hope. Throughout history, democracy has survived because ordinary people fought for it. The Athenians who built the first democracy, the Romans who created the Republic, the English who won Magna Carta, the Americans who fought the Revolution, the suffragettes who won women's voting rights, the civil rights activists who ended segregation, the dissidents who brought down the Berlin Wall. None of these people were superhuman. They were ordinary people who recognized that their moment required action. They were people who believed that government of the people, by the people, for the people, should not perish from the earth. We're living through such a moment now. The decisions we make, the actions we take or don't take, will shape whether democracy survives and thrives or whether it fades into history as a noble experiment that ultimately failed. And here's the beautiful thing. You don't have to do everything. No one person can save democracy. But if millions of people each do something, vote, volunteer, speak up, stay informed, engage with their communities, those individual actions add up to something powerful. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It's not something that happens to you. It's something you participate in. Every generation has to choose democracy anew, has to defend it, has to improve it. We've covered a lot of ground today, from Cleisthenes in ancient Athens to the challenges of the 21st century, from the birth of democracy to its expansion in America, from its near-death experiences to its remarkable resilience. If there's one theme that runs through this entire history, it's this: democracy is always unfinished business. The Athenians created democracy, but excluded most of their population. The Romans built a republic that collapsed into empire. The American founders proclaimed that all men are created equal while denying equality to most people. For centuries, American democracy excluded women, black people, Native Americans, and others. Even today, we're still working to fulfill democracy's promise. But that's not a flaw. It's the nature of democracy. It's a system based on the idea that government should evolve as society evolves, that each generation should have a say in shaping their own future, that we can always do better. The entire history of democracy is a story of expansion. Expanding who gets to participate, expanding what rights are protected, expanding the scope of democratic governance. That expansion has never been smooth or inevitable. It's been won through struggle, sacrifice, and the determination of people who believed that democracy was worth fighting for. American democracy specifically has been a laboratory for democratic experimentation. Not always successful, often hypocritical, frequently falling short of its ideals, but also remarkably resilient, capable of self-correction, and influential far beyond its borders. The American experiment matters because it's asked a question that resonates worldwide. Can a diverse, sprawling, continental nation govern itself democratically? Can people of different backgrounds, beliefs, and interests live together under a system of laws they create for themselves? Can democracy deliver prosperity, security, and freedom? For nearly 250 years, despite civil war, depression, assassinations, scandals, and everything else, the answer has been a qualified yes. Qualified because the work is never finished. Qualified because there have been serious failures along the way. But yes, nonetheless. The question for our time is whether that answer will continue to be yes. Whether this generation will keep the republic. Whether we'll continue the work of expanding democracy, or whether we'll let it fade. I don't know the answer. Nobody does. The future isn't written. It will be determined by choices, millions of individual choices by people like you about whether to engage or disengage, to hope or despair, to act or accept. What I do know is this: democracy is worth it. For all its flaws, for all its frustrations, democracy remains humanity's best hope for government that respects human dignity, protects human freedom, and gives people control over their own lives. As we face the challenges of the 21st century, climate change, technological disruption, rising authoritarianism, and growing inequality, we need democracy more than ever. We need systems that can adapt to new challenges, that can self-correct when they fail, that can channel conflict into productive solutions. The entire history of democracy teaches us that it's possible, that ordinary people working together can create something extraordinary. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, doesn't have to perish from the earth. But it also teaches us that democracy requires each of us. It requires your voice, your vote, your participation, your vigilance. So here's my challenge to you. Don't just watch this video and move on. Do something. Vote in the next election. Have a conversation with someone you disagree with. Learn about an issue you don't understand. Volunteer for a cause you care about. Run for local office. Teach a young person about democracy. Hold your representatives accountable. Do something. Because 2,500 years ago, Cleisthenes stood before a crowd and proposed a crazy idea that the people should rule themselves. Against all odds, that idea survived. It evolved. It spread. It shaped the modern world. That idea, that experiment, that promise, democracy, now depends on you. Thanks for watching. If you found this valuable, please like, subscribe, and share. Let me know in the comments what you think the future holds for democracy. And most importantly, go out there and participate in it. Democracy isn't just history. It's happening right now, and you're part of it.